The wind was a predator here, a constant, gnawing thing that peeled skin from bone and hope from the soul. Elara huddled deeper into the shallow overhang of rock, the thin shawl offering little defense against its teeth. Dust, fine and sharp, worked its way into her eyes, her mouth, coating everything with the taste of desolation. 2 days. It had been 2 days since the wagon track had vanished back into the shimmering haze, taking with it the last vestiges of her former life, leaving her stranded with a broken wheel and an empty promise. Fear was a physical weight in her chest, heavy and cold, pressing the air from her lungs. She was alone, utterly alone, in a place that seemed to actively resent her presence. Every creak of the rock, every howl of the wind, sounded like a threat. Her provisions were gone, scavenged by coyotes in the first night, bold in the face of her weakness. Hunger was no longer a pang but a deep, vibrating ache that made her dizzy. She pressed a hand to her flat belly, a futile gesture against the emptiness. The sun, when it managed to pierce the dust-laden sky, was merciless, baking the rock until it radiated heat, then plunging into a brutal chill as dusk fell. She had tried to walk, stumbling north under the indifferent gaze of the vultures circling high above, but her strength had failed quickly. Her feet were raw blisters, her lips cracked and bleeding. The world had shrunk to the size of this small, cold pocket in the rock face, a miserable sanctuary from the elements, but no refuge from the gnawing fear. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the stark reality of her situation. The vast, empty landscape stretching in every direction, the crushing silence broken only by the relentless wind. This was not living. This was simply waiting for the end, a slow, agonizing fade into the dust. Memories flickered, cruel in their contrast to her present misery. A warm hearth, a kind hand, a gentle voice. They felt like they belonged to another person, another lifetime. This life, the one she now inhabited, was stripped bare of comfort, of kindness, of hope. She was a shadow in the shadows, a ghost before her time, forgotten by the world that had cast her out. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming terror of her vulnerability. A lone woman, isolated and helpless, was easy prey, not just for the elements or the scavengers of the wild, but for the darker elements of humanity that sometimes drifted through these forgotten places. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, a small, fragile knot of despair against the indifferent immensity of the land. The dust continued its tireless assault, a reminder of what she would soon become if something did not change. She must have slept, a fitful, shallow doze punctuated by shivers and the phantom sounds of approach. When she opened her eyes, the light was different, softer, the sun lower in the sky, and there was a shape, a man. He stood some distance away, silhouetted against the pale sky, utterly still, observing her. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every instinct screamed danger. She scrambled backward, pressing herself flatter against the rock, trying to make herself invisible. He made no move towards her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered even under the layers of rough fabric he wore. A wide-brimmed hat obscured most of his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder, a silent declaration of capability in this unforgiving land. He was a stranger, an unknown, and in her experience, strangers brought pain or indifference, rarely help. He remained for a long moment, a statue against the setting sun. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing back the way he had come. A wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of fear. Had he seen her weakness? Would he return with others? She stayed frozen until the light failed completely and the stars, cold and distant, began to prick the inky sky. Just as the cold was becoming unbearable again, a low sound drifted to her, the crackle of a small fire. It was close. Hesitantly, cautiously, she crawled to the edge of the overhang and peered out. Below, maybe 50 yards away, was a small, smokeless fire, carefully built in a shallow pit. And beside it, the man sat. He wasn't looking towards her. He was simply tending the flames, his movements slow and deliberate. The scent of wood smoke, faint but real, was like a cruel taunt to her empty stomach. Still, fear held her captive. She watched him for a long time, her body aching with cold and hunger, her mind racing. He made no attempt to approach her. He simply existed, a quiet presence in the vast emptiness. At one point, he stood up and walked away from the fire, disappearing into the darkness for a few minutes before returning. When he sat back down, she saw he had placed something small near the edge of the firelight, away from the flames. He then settled back, his back to her, seemingly ignoring her existence. Curiosity warred with her terror. What had he left? Driven by desperate need, a need that finally overshadowed her fear, she waited until the fire had burned down to embers and the man seemed to be asleep, his form a dark shape beside the dying light. Then, painfully, she crept out from under the rock. The ground was cold under her bare feet. Every tiny sound seemed amplified in the stillness. She kept her eyes on the dark form of the man. He did not move. Slowly, agonizingly, she made her way down the gentle slope towards the dying fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs. When she reached the spot where he had left the object, her trembling fingers found something wrapped in cloth. She fumbled with it, her breath catching in her throat. It was food. Dried meat, tough but undeniably real, and a piece of hardtack biscuit. Simple, humble, but to her starving body, it was a lifeline. She ate sparingly, chewing the tough meat slowly, letting the meager sustenance spread through her system. The man had not stirred. He was still there when dawn broke, a silent, watchful presence. He did not look at her as she ate the last of the biscuit. He simply rose, extinguished the embers of the fire with sand, and began to pack his minimal gear. She expected him to leave, to disappear as quickly as he had appeared. But he didn't. He walked towards her overhang, stopping a respectful distance away. He still hadn't spoken. His gaze was steady, unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Alara tensed, ready to flee, though where to, she didn't know. Instead of speaking, he gestured with his chin towards the south. A silent question? An offer? Her mind struggled to comprehend. He wasn't a threat, not in the way she had expected. He hadn't harmed her, hadn't demanded anything. He had simply given. Given fire, given food, given presence without pressure. Hesitantly, her voice a dry croak from disuse, she managed, Where are you going?" His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, a deep rumble that seemed to resonate with the quiet strength she sensed about him. "South. There's water 2 days' ride. A settlement, maybe 3 inch." He paused, his eyes, gray and steady, finally meeting hers. They were kind, she realized with a jolt. Weary, perhaps, but kind. It's a hard walk, a simple statement of fact. He wasn't offering pity, just acknowledging the reality. He didn't offer to carry her, didn't make grand promises. He just waited. The decision felt momentous, terrifying. Trusting him was a leap into the unknown, but staying here was certain death. She looked back at the desolate landscape, then at the man, his patience a quiet anchor in the chaos of her fear. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. I will come." He gave another small nod in return, then turned and began to walk, his pace slow and steady, deliberately calibrated, she realized, for someone following on foot. He didn't look back to see if she followed. He simply trusted that she would. Gathering her shawl and the empty cloth wrapper, she pushed herself to her feet. Her muscles screamed in protest, her feet burned, but a flicker of determination, long extinguished, began to glow in the pit of her stomach. She took her first step, then another, following the silent figure ahead. The world was still vast, still dangerous, but now there were 2 sets of footprints in the dust. The journey was brutal. The sun beat down, the wind whipped, and every step was an act of will. She fell often, scraped her knees and hands on the unforgiving ground. But the man never went too far ahead. He would stop occasionally, waiting for her to catch up, sometimes leaving a small amount of water from his canteen on a rock for her, refilling it later from a hidden spring she wouldn't have known how to find. There was still little talk between them. Their communication was one of actions, of presence, of a shared struggle against the elements. He learned her pace, she learned the rhythm of his stride. As they traveled, she began to observe him more closely. His name was Silas. He spoke it only once when she asked. He didn't ask hers, respecting her silence. He was quiet, watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He seemed to know the land intimately, where the ground was firmer, where the shade was deepest during the hottest part of the day, where hidden springs could be found. He never complained, never showed frustration at her slowness. There was a quiet strength about him that was comforting, a rock in the shifting sands of her fear. She noticed the way he handled his rifle, with a practiced ease that spoke of necessity, not aggression. He hunted small game occasionally, sharing the meager meal equally, cooking it over a small fire built precisely to minimize smoke. He didn't pry about her past, didn't ask why she was alone, why she had nothing. He simply accepted her presence and offered what he could. Tentative trust began to bloom, a fragile thing nurtured by shared hardship and his quiet competence. She still flinched sometimes at sudden movements, a legacy of past hurts. But he seemed to understand, his own movements often slow and deliberate around her. They found the water hole Silas had spoken of. A small, muddy pool. But it was water, life-giving water, and she drank deeply, splashing the cool liquid on her face. They rested there for a day, replenishing their meager supply. The thought of the settlement, the maybe of it, hung between them, a potential destination but also a source of unease. Settlements meant people, and people often brought judgment, suspicion, and the same kind of cruelty she had fled. She wasn't ready to face the world again, not in her current state, not with the shadows still clinging to her. Silas seemed to sense her reluctance. He didn't press her. When they moved on, he led them not directly towards where the settlement might be, but on a parallel course, following a less traveled path that skirted the main trails. One evening, as they huddled by the fire, the wind carrying the distant sound of voices from a ranch they were passing wide of, her fear resurfaced, cold and sharp. She instinctively moved closer to the fire, seeking its meager warmth, its illusion of safety. Silas, without a word, shifted his position slightly, placing himself between her and the direction of the sound. It was a small gesture, protective and silent, but it spoke volumes. It was the first time she felt truly guarded, truly seen and valued, not for what she could offer, but simply as someone worthy of protection. A knot in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't just a burden, a straggler he had taken pity on. She was, in some unspoken way, his responsibility now, and he accepted it without complaint. This realization, this quiet acceptance, was a balm to her wounded spirit. The journey was still arduous, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone in the fight. She looked at Silas, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, lines of hardship etched around his eyes, but his gaze steady and calm. He wasn't a rescuer in the stories, a knight on a white horse. He was just a man, walking through a difficult world, who had chosen, for reasons unknown to her, not to walk past her despair. Their quiet journey was shattered near a dusty crossroads town. They had been avoiding settlements, but needed supplies. As they approached the edge of the cluster of buildings, a group of men lounging outside a saloon spotted them. Their gazes, heavy with suspicion and crude assessment, landed first on Alara, then lingered on Silas. One of them, a burly man with a stained shirt, called out, his voice slurred, "Well now, what's this?" A stray bird with a quiet coyote. Laughter followed. Alara froze, the old fear gripping her, making her want to shrink into the ground. She saw the way their eyes raked over her, the assumptions being made. This was the judgment, the cruelty she had feared. Silas stopped, his body going still. He didn't reach for his rifle, but his stance was one of coiled readiness. "We're just passing through," he said. his voice low and even, betraying none of the tension Alara felt radiating from him. The burly man pushed off the wall, swaggering towards them. Passing through? With her. He gestured towards Alara with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. Looks more like you found yourself some company you didn't pay for. His companions laughed louder. Alara felt her face burn with shame and fear. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Silas took a half-step forward, subtly placing more of his body between Alara and the men. "She's with me," he stated, his voice hardening slightly. The burly man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowed. "Is she now? And who's asking? You some kind of law?" Silas didn't answer. He just held the man's gaze, his silence more formidable than any threat. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Alara watched Silas, seeing not just the quiet man who had helped her survive, but a protector, someone willing to stand against hostility for her sake. Something shifted within her. She was tired of being the victim, tired of being defined by others' cruelty and judgment. She straightened her shoulders, just a fraction, but it felt like a monumental effort. Her gaze, though still wary, met the burly man's, holding it steady. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was here, standing beside Silas, and she wouldn't wither under their gaze. The burly man hesitated, perhaps surprised by Silas's quiet resolve and Alara's unexpected defiance. He glanced back at his friends, then spit on the ground near Silas's feet. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, though the threat lingered in his eyes. He backed away slowly, returning to his companions, who grumbled but made no move to press the issue. Silas didn't move until the men had turned their attention back to their drinking. Only then did the tension seem to leach from his body. He didn't look at Alara immediately. He just stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the saloon. Alara looked at him, gratitude and something more profound welling up inside her. He hadn't fought them, hadn't resorted to violence, but he had faced them down with nothing but his presence and quiet strength. And he had stood with her. Gathering her courage, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. He turned his head then, his gray eyes meeting hers. There was a shared understanding in that look, a silent acknowledgement of the moment, of the threat faced and overcome together. It wasn't about being rescued anymore. It was about standing together. They didn't stop in the town. Silas led them away from it, the taste of dust and judgment still lingering. As they walked, the silence between them was different now, no longer born of uncertainty, but of shared experience. Later that evening, camped under a sky thick with stars, Alara finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been days ago. Silas nodded, his gaze on the fire. "Didn't need thanks?" "Yes," she insisted gently. "I did." She paused, gathering her thoughts. They saw only what they wanted to see. What they expected. Silas was silent for a moment. People see what they're looking for. It was a simple truth, profound in its quiet delivery. Alara looked at the fire, its flames a small, warm heart against the cold night. "I lived in the shadows," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Hiding. From everything." From them, she gestured vaguely back the way they had come, encompassing not just the men in the town, but the circumstances that had led her to this desolate place. You didn't make me hide." Silas finally turned to look at her fully. His expression was open, free of the guardedness she had seen in the town. "Didn't see anything to hide." A wave of emotion washed over Alara, sharp and sweet. He saw her, not a victim, not an outcast, but simply Alara. In his eyes, in his actions, he had given her back her dignity. He had not rescued her in the way of fairy tales, but in the way of the real world, with practical aid, with quiet protection, and with the simple act of seeing her worth when others saw none. "Before," she continued, her voice low but steady, "life was just pain." And waiting, she looked from the fire to the vast, starlit sky. Now there's possibility, hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. Silas didn't respond with grand words. He simply added another piece of wood to the fire, the small flames leaping higher, casting a warm, welcoming light. He looked at her again, and this time, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, a gentle acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the long road they had traveled, both physically and emotionally. He wasn't just a rescuer, he was a companion. The harsh environment hadn't changed. The world outside their small firelight was still vast and indifferent, but something fundamental within Alara had shifted. The fear had receded, replaced by a quiet resilience, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced her despair, and she had chosen to walk, step by painful step, towards the light, guided by a silent, steady hand. Life was still a struggle, the shadows still existed, but she was no longer living in them. She was walking out, and she was not walking alone. The wind still howled its lonely song, but the fire offered warmth, and the presence beside her offered a different kind of heat, the quiet, enduring warmth of connection found in the most unlikely of places. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames, two figures etched against the vast, indifferent canvas of the night, their shared journey just beginning, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected kindness that could bloom even in the harshest of soils.